A black doctor, exhausted from saving lives during a grueling hospital shift, boards a plane, ready to finally rest on his flight home. But when he takes his seat, everything changes. A flight attendant unfairly targets him, escalating a minor interaction into an outright assault, humiliating him in front of stunned passengers. Just 10 minutes later, her life changes forever as she's fired on the spot. What happens next is a powerful story about resilience, justice, and the fight for dignity that no one saw coming. Stay with me, this is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. And if this story resonates with you, be sure to subscribe for more like it. It started as just another flight, but it became so much more. It began the way most journeys begin, quietly. A soft hum of engines, the shuffle of passengers squeezing into narrow rows, and the occasional voice murmuring in polite monotone. Dr. Elijah Bennett sat in seat 7B, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, his mind lingering on the patients he had left behind just hours ago. He was used to long days, used to being needed. What he wasn't used to was the bone-deep weariness that came from moving through a world that seemed to question his belonging at every turn. The flight from Atlanta to Chicago wasn't supposed to be anything but routine. Elijah had booked his ticket weeks in advance, opting for a seat that offered just enough legroom to stretch, knowing he would need the rest before another demanding shift at the hospital. His carry-on, neatly packed with a change of clothes and a few medical journals, fit snugly in the overhead bin. He thought of it as a small, unspoken victory. Not every battle needed to be fought. But not all battles announce themselves. Some creep in slowly, dressed in small slights and indifferent glances, until they swell into something undeniable. The first moment came innocuously enough. As Elijah adjusted his seatbelt, Karen Hollis, the flight attendant, appeared in the aisle beside him. She was young, late 20s at most, with a crisp uniform and a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her tone was clipped but professional. "Sir, your bag is blocking the aisle. Please move it." Elijah nodded. Of course. He stood, lifting the bag and adjusting it further into the compartment. He'd done this 100 times before, on 100 different flights. But as he sat back down, he couldn't help but notice the way Karen lingered, her gaze scanning him as if she were measuring something invisible. He met her eyes briefly, then looked away. It wasn't worth it, he told himself. It never was. The second moment came as the plane prepared for takeoff. Elijah noticed Karen moving briskly up and down the aisle, her expression tighter now. Her body language spoke volumes, a stiffness in her shoulders, a curt nod to passengers who greeted her. When she passed him again, he offered her a small smile, an olive branch for reasons he didn't fully understand. "Long day?" he asked, his voice warm but cautious. Karen stopped abruptly, her head turning toward him as though he'd said something offensive. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Elijah thought she might simply walk away. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her voice low and cutting. "This isn't the time for small talk," she snapped. Elijah blinked, startled by the sharpness of her words. The passenger beside him shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to notice. He held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "My apologies," he said. Karen said nothing. She straightened her posture and moved on. But the air around Elijah felt heavier now, tinged with something he couldn't quite name. He glanced around the cabin. Most passengers were absorbed in their own worlds, scrolling through phones, flipping through magazines, or closing their eyes against the fluorescent hum of the cabin lights. But Elijah felt it, an undercurrent of tension, small but persistent, like a pebble in a shoe. The third moment came not long after. Karen returned to check the overhead bins, her movements brisk and deliberate. This time, she paused directly in front of Elijah's seat. Without explanation, she pulled his bag down and inspected it, her hands moving over the zippers and handles with a scrutiny that felt far more personal than procedural. "Is there a problem?" Elijah asked, his tone calm but firm. Karen didn't answer right away. Instead, she placed the bag back in the bin, her movements slower now, almost theatrical. When she finally spoke, her voice was loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We need to ensure the aisle stays clear. Safety regulations." Elijah said nothing. What could he say? That he knew this wasn't about safety? That he'd seen this script before? In boardrooms, at hospital corridors, on sidewalks? He let the silence hang between them, choosing his dignity over confrontation. But dignity doesn't erase the stain. It doesn't soften the edges of humiliation or shield you from the glances of those around you, some curious, some sympathetic, and others all too eager to look away. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Elijah leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. He tried to let the hum of the engines drown out the tension in his chest. But even then, he could feel it, the unspoken question that trailed him through every airport, every conference, every space where he wasn't expected to be. What is a man like you doing here? For most people on that flight, it was just another journey. For Elijah, it was the beginning of something far more consequential. A quiet storm was brewing, its winds gathering strength in the hidden spaces between words and actions. He couldn't see it yet, but he could feel it, a truth as persistent as the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Some storms announce themselves with thunder. Others arrive silently, waiting for the right moment to break. And this storm was about to break wide open. The cabin hummed with a restless stillness. Seatbelt signs blinked overhead, and the attendants' voices echoed faintly through the intercom, issuing the same instructions everyone pretended not to need. Elijah Bennett sat motionless in his seat, his hands resting on his lap, his mind replaying Karen Hollis's words. This isn't the time for small talk. They had been sharp and deliberate, not the offhand response of someone merely having a bad day. He wanted to dismiss it, to let it fall into the ocean of petty indignities he'd learned to swallow over the years. But something about the moment lingered, clinging to him like damp air before a storm. As the plane steadied at cruising altitude, Karen returned to the aisle, pushing a cart laden with snacks and drinks. Her face was calm now, practiced. She handed out cups of water and tiny pretzel packets. Her interactions clipped but functional. When she reached Elijah's row, her composure faltered. "Something to drink?" she asked, her voice neutral but tight, as if the words were being forced through clenched teeth. "Just water, thank you," Elijah replied evenly, refusing to match her tension. She poured the water, her hand trembling slightly, and the cup tipped over, spilling onto Elijah's lap. "Oh," she said flatly, as if observing a weather report. Passengers nearby turned to look, some with mild amusement, others with open concern. Elijah wiped at his trousers with a napkin she handed him, but the paper was too flimsy to make a difference. "It happens," he said, attempting to de-escalate. "It's been a long day," Karen muttered, her tone laced with something more than fatigue. She moved on, leaving Elijah to sit in his damp seat, the air around him heavy with discomfort. It could have ended there, but discomfort rarely ends where it begins. As the hours passed, Karen's movements became more erratic. Her interactions with other passengers remained professional, but there was a pointedness to her avoidance of Elijah. She seemed to hover near his row, her eyes flickering in his direction but never quite meeting his. The tension finally boiled over when Elijah stood to stretch his legs. He stepped into the aisle and made his way toward the restroom, his movements deliberate and careful, as they always were in public spaces. He understood the choreography of his body in predominantly white environments, the need to appear non-threatening, to move with a practiced ease that signaled he belonged. As he waited outside the restroom, Karen approached him again. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat," she said, her voice carrying a brittle authority. "I'll return shortly," Elijah replied calmly. Her tone sharpened. "It's for safety reasons." Elijah turned to face her fully, his voice steady but firm. "The seatbelt sign is off. Is there a problem?" Karen hesitated, her eyes darting to the passengers nearby. It was clear she hadn't expected him to challenge her. "No problem," she said curtly, stepping aside. But as Elijah returned to his seat, he could feel the weight of her gaze on his back, like a spotlight he hadn't asked for. The turning point came when Karen stopped in the middle of the aisle, speaking loudly enough for others to hear. "Some passengers don't seem to understand basic safety protocols," she announced, her eyes cutting toward Elijah's row. A murmur spread through the cabin. Elijah could feel the shift in the air, the subtle change in how the other passengers looked at him. It wasn't just curiosity, it was suspicion. The man seated beside Elijah leaned over and whispered, "What's her problem?" Elijah didn't respond. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the urge to stand up and demand an explanation. But he knew better. He had been here before, in countless variations of this scene. He had learned that indignation was a luxury not afforded to men who looked like him. Instead, he straightened his posture, his hands resting calmly on his knees. He would not give her the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. The final blow came as the plane began its descent. Karen returned to Elijah's row, her voice sharp and clipped. "Sir, I'll need you to ensure your carry-on is properly secured." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "It already is." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If you can't follow instructions, I'll have to report you." The words hung in the air like an accusation, their weight pressing against Elijah's chest. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and said nothing. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. The unspoken tension between them had become something everyone could feel, even if they didn't fully understand it. Karen turned abruptly and walked away, leaving Elijah to sit in the silence she'd created. Around him, passengers exchanged nervous glances, their whispers barely audible. By the time the plane landed, Elijah felt as though he had carried the weight of 1,000 unseen battles. This wasn't about a spilled drink or an inconvenient instruction. It was about something deeper, something older than both of them. It was about the quiet violence of being reduced to a symbol, a target, a problem to be solved. As the plane taxied to the gate, Elijah stared out the window, the city lights of Chicago glittering in the distance. He thought about the patients waiting for him, the lives he would save tomorrow. And he wondered, not for the first time, how many small wars he would have to endure before he could simply be seen for who he was, a man. No more and no less. The storm was no longer gathering. It was here, and Elijah knew it was far from over. The plane rolled to a stop at the gate, its cabin filling with the hum of unspoken tension. Passengers moved in fits and starts, collecting their belongings, avoiding eye contact with one another. Dr. Elijah Bennett remained seated, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his face composed. Outwardly, he was calm, but inside, his thoughts churned. The events of the past 2 hours hung in the air like smoke, thick and acrid, clinging to everything. Karen Hollis stood near the front of the cabin, her posture rigid, her face set in a tight mask of professionalism. But her eyes betrayed her a flicker of uncertainty, of something teetering on the edge of control. Elijah watched her from his seat, his gaze steady and deliberate. He was not a man who sought conflict, but he was also not a man who ran from it. As the senior flight attendant, Rosa Martinez, approached Elijah's row, the tension between him and Karen became impossible to ignore. Rosa's voice was soft but firm, her tone the careful diplomacy of someone accustomed to managing crises. "Sir, is everything all right here?" she asked. Elijah took a breath before answering. "I'd like to speak with the captain," he said, his voice low but steady. "There's been an incident." Karen stiffened visibly, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Rosa glanced between them, her expression unreadable, but she nodded. "Of course, Dr. Bennett, please wait here." The cabin grew quieter as passengers realized something was unfolding. The whispers started in the back rows, moving forward like ripples on water. Elijah could feel their eyes on him, their curiosity mingling with something else, something darker. A middle-aged man 2 rows back leaned over to his seatmate. "What's going on up there?" he muttered. "Don't know," came the reply, laced with the kind of suspicion that didn't need to be said aloud. Elijah ignored them, keeping his focus on Rosa as she disappeared toward the cockpit. But he could feel the weight of those stares, the subtle shift in the air that always seemed to follow him wherever he went. Karen remained rooted to her spot at the front of the cabin. Her face flushed. For the first time, she seemed unsure of herself, her carefully constructed authority beginning to fray at the edges. Minutes later, Rosa returned with the captain, a tall man in his 50s whose uniform carried the creases of a long day. His expression was calm but serious as he approached Elijah. "I'm Captain Harris," he said, extending a hand. "I understand there's been an issue?" Elijah shook his hand, noting the captain's firm grip and steady gaze. "Yes," he replied, "I was subjected to unprovoked aggression by one of your crew members." The captain's brows furrowed. "Aggression?" "Yes," Elijah said, his tone measured. "Ms. Hollis struck me during the flight. There are witnesses." A murmur swept through the cabin, louder this time. Passengers craned their necks to get a better view, their curiosity now mingled with disbelief. Karen stepped forward, her voice sharp. "That's not what happened," she said quickly. He was being disruptive. The captain held up a hand to silence her. "Ms. Hollis, I'll speak with you in a moment." Karen opened her mouth to argue but thought better of it, stepping back with a huff. As the captain spoke with Elijah, passengers began to chime in. A young black woman seated across the aisle raised her hand. "I saw it," she said, her voice clear and firm. "He didn't do anything. She slapped him out of nowhere." Another passenger, an older white man, hesitated before speaking. I didn't see the whole thing," he said, "but I heard it. Sounded like it came out of the blue." Karen's face grew redder with every word. She looked at Rosa, then the captain, as if searching for support. But none came. The tension reached its breaking point when a passenger in the back stood up. Holding his phone, "I recorded it," he announced. "The whole thing." The cabin erupted in gasps and murmurs as the man made his way forward. Karen's face drained of color, her confidence collapsing entirely. The captain reviewed the footage in silence, his expression hardening as he watched. When he finally looked up, his eyes were cold. "Ms. Hollis," he said, his voice sharp, "please step into the galley with me." The confrontation between Karen and the captain took place behind a curtain. But the cabin remained charged with anticipation. Passengers whispered and exchanged knowing looks. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others seemed to revel in the drama. Elijah sat quietly, his composure intact, but inside he felt a mix of emotions: anger, exhaustion, vindication. He had done nothing to provoke this, but he had still been forced to defend his very humanity in front of a plane full of strangers. When Karen finally emerged from the galley, her face was pale and drawn. Rosa followed close behind, her expression somber. Karen didn't look at Elijah as she walked past him, escorted by airport security personnel who had boarded moments earlier. The passengers watched in stunned silence as she was led off the plane. Her head bowed, her once crisp uniform rumpled and disheveled. As the plane prepared for deboarding, Captain Harris approached Elijah again. "Dr. Bennett," he said, his tone apologetic, "on behalf of the airline, I want to sincerely apologize for what happened here. This is unacceptable, and we'll be conducting a full investigation." Elijah nodded, his face unreadable. "Thank you," he said simply. The captain hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "You handled this with remarkable composure," he said finally. "I'm sorry you had to." Elijah said nothing. There was nothing more to say. As he gathered his belongings and prepared to leave the plane, he caught sight of the young woman who had spoken up for him earlier. She gave him a small nod, and he returned it, a brief moment of solidarity in an otherwise isolating experience. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered. Elijah walked through the airport terminal, his steps heavy, his mind racing. He had been here before, in countless ways and in countless places. And he knew, with a weary certainty, that he would be here again. The storm was never really over. It was always waiting, just beyond the horizon, ready to break again. The airport terminal, with its polished floors and fluorescent lights, should have offered a reprieve from the claustrophobic tension of the flight. But for Dr. Elijah Bennett, the space felt no different than the plane he had just stepped off. The same stares lingered, the same whispers hung in the air, and the same quiet judgments moved invisibly around him, like shadows he couldn't shake. As he walked toward the baggage claim, a man in a navy blazer hurried to catch up to him. "Dr. Bennett," he said, his voice polite but firm. Elijah turned, recognizing the airline representative from his name tag. "I'm James Caldwell," the man said, extending a hand. "On behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for what happened during your flight. We'll be conducting a full investigation, and I assure you, we take this matter very seriously." Elijah shook the man's hand, though the gesture felt perfunctory. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice was calm. But there was a weariness in it, a weariness born not just from the day's events but from a lifetime of similar apologies, each one arriving too late to matter. Caldwell hesitated, as though he wanted to say more but wasn't sure how to proceed. Finally, he asked, "Is there anything we can do to make this right?" Elijah met the man's gaze, his expression steady. "Making it right," he said quietly, "starts long before the apology." Caldwell nodded, his face flushed. "Of course. I'll be in touch." Elijah watched him walk away, the words hanging in the air like the faint echo of an old song. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the gesture, it was just that he'd heard it all before. Apologies were easy. Change was hard. At baggage claim, the tension followed him. A middle-aged white man stood a few feet away, scrolling through his phone. Elijah could feel the man's glances, quick and furtive, as though he were trying to place the face he'd just seen in the news clips already making their way onto social media. Elijah ignored him, his focus on the conveyor belt as the luggage began to emerge. But the man couldn't hold back. "Hey," he said, stepping closer. "You're the doctor from the flight, right? The one with the attendant?" Elijah's shoulders tensed, but he kept his voice even. "I am." "Man, that was something," the man said, shaking his head. "I mean, it's crazy what people think they can get away with these days." Elijah didn't respond. He didn't need to. The man's words weren't for him, they were for himself. A way to signal that he was one of the good ones. That he saw what others didn't. But Elijah had heard it all before. And he knew better than to linger in the shallow waters of performative outrage. The man fidgeted, clearly expecting more of a response. When none came, he muttered something about it being unbelievable, and wandered back to his corner of the room. As Elijah left the terminal and stepped into the cool Chicago evening, he felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. He thought of calling his wife, Vanessa, to tell her what had happened. But he hesitated. How many times had they had this conversation before? How many times had he come home with stories of microaggressions? Of slights disguised as politeness? Of outright hostility cloaked in professionalism? She would listen, as she always did, with patience and understanding, but the weight of these stories didn't just rest on him, it rested on her, too. And tonight, Elijah wasn't sure he had the strength to share that burden. The ride home was quiet. Save for the faint hum of the radio in the background, Elijah stared out the window, watching the city pass by in blurred streaks of light and shadow. His mind replayed the day's events, each moment unfolding like a scene in a play he'd seen too many times before. It wasn't just about Karen Hollis, though she was the catalyst. It was about the unspoken rules that governed his existence, the rules that said he had to be twice as polite, twice as composed, and twice as patient to be seen as half as worthy. It was about the weight of being a black man in spaces that weren't made for him, and the exhaustion of constantly having to prove his right to exist within them. By the time the car pulled up to his home, Elijah felt the exhaustion settle deep into his bones. He stepped out, thanked the driver, and made his way inside. Vanessa was waiting for him in the living room, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "You're late," she said gently, though her tone carried a note of concern. "There was a situation," Elijah said, his voice trailing off. Vanessa's brow furrowed. "What happened?" He hesitated, then sat down beside her, the words spilling out in measured tones. He told her about Karen, about the slap, about the passengers who spoke up and the ones who stayed silent. He told her about the apology from the captain, the representative at the airport, and the man at baggage claim who had wanted to align himself with Elijah's pain without truly understanding it. When he finished, Vanessa reached for his hand. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steady but soft. "You didn't deserve that." Elijah nodded, though her words did little to ease the ache in his chest. "It's not the first time," he said quietly, "and it won't be the last." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the day settling between them. Finally, Vanessa spoke. "Do you want to file a formal complaint?" Elijah considered it. He thought about the airline's promises, the investigation they had assured him would take place. He thought about the passengers who had recorded the incident, the videos that were likely already spreading online. And he thought about Karen, her anger, her defiance, and the system that had shaped her into someone who could look at a man like him and see not a doctor, but a threat. "I don't know," he said at last. "I want to believe it will make a difference. But sometimes I wonder if anything ever really changes." Vanessa squeezed his hand. "It changes when people like you refuse to let it slide." Elijah looked at her, his resolve hardening. She was right, of course. She always was. But change, he knew, came slowly if it came at all. That night, as Elijah lay awake in bed, he found himself thinking not about the slap, but about the moments before it, the glances, the words left unsaid, the unspoken rules that had shaped the entire encounter. The slap was only the culmination. The real damage had been done long before. And that, he realized, was the hardest part, not the slap itself, but the world that made it possible. The storm had broken, but the skies were still dark. The morning after the flight, Dr. Elijah Bennett sat at his kitchen table, the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains. A steaming mug of coffee sat untouched in front of him. Vanessa bustled in the background, moving with purpose, but her glances toward him were heavy with worry. "You didn't sleep," she said, not as a question but as a statement. Elijah shook his head. "Couldn't turn my mind off." Vanessa placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "You don't have to face this alone," she said, but Elijah wasn't sure that was true. For all the solidarity he had felt from certain passengers on the flight, the events of the previous day had left him with a familiar loneliness. It wasn't the isolation of being physically alone, it was the isolation of being unseen, of knowing that even now, not everyone understood what had truly transpired. The day unfolded as if the world hadn't shifted. The hospital was busy, patients in and out, their needs immediate and unrelenting. Elijah moved through his rounds with practiced efficiency. But the undercurrent of tension from the flight lingered. It wasn't long before the murmurs started. A nurse approached him cautiously during his break. "I saw the video," she said, her voice low. It's all over the internet. Are you okay?" Elijah offered her a polite smile. "I'm fine, thank you." But he wasn't fine. And the video wasn't just a video, it was a magnifying glass, forcing the world to confront something Elijah had long since learned to navigate: the quiet violence of systemic bias. The hospital cafeteria buzzed with muted conversation. Elijah took his usual seat by the window, his tray untouched. Across the room, he could feel the weight of gazes from colleagues. Some were furtive, others more direct, but none were accompanied by words. One doctor, a man Elijah had worked with for years, finally approached. "Hey," the man said, sitting down uninvited. "I saw the news. Wild stuff." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Wild isn't the word I'd use." The man chuckled awkwardly, misreading the moment. "I mean, she must have been crazy, right? Just snapping like that?" Elijah's gaze hardened. It wasn't about her losing control. It was about what she thought she could get away with. The other doctor blinked, caught off guard. "I didn't mean anything by it," he said, retreating into his discomfort. "Just saying, it's a shame. You know, people need to be more professional." Elijah didn't respond. The man's words felt like another slap, not with malice, but with the carelessness of someone who didn't understand the depth of what had happened. Later that evening, Elijah sat in his study, scrolling through emails. Among the usual correspondence were messages from journalists, legal teams, and strangers who had seen the viral video. Some were supportive, their words filled with outrage on his behalf. Others were dismissive, questioning what had led to the altercation, as if Elijah's mere existence in that space required justification. One email, in particular, caught his eye. It was from an advocacy group, offering to help him use his story to highlight racial bias in corporate America. The offer was well-intentioned, but it left Elijah feeling conflicted. Did he want to become a symbol, another face for a cause that would burn brightly in the public eye before fading into obscurity? As the days passed, the video continued to spread. It became fodder for talk shows and social media debates, each narrative bending to the biases of its audience. On one program, a panel of pundits debated the incident. "I don't understand why everyone's making this about race," one panelist said, her voice sharp. "Maybe she was just stressed." "Stressed doesn't give you the right to assault someone," another countered. "Sure, but we don't know the whole story." The first replied, "Let's not jump to conclusions." Elijah turned off the TV, his stomach tightening. The slap wasn't the story, it was the symptom. The story was in the unspoken rules that allowed someone like Karen to feel justified in her actions, and in the societal blind spots that let others excuse them. The tipping point came when Elijah received a call from his hospital's board of directors. They wanted to meet with him to discuss the situation. When Elijah entered the boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The hospital's legal counsel sat at one end of the table, flanked by the chief administrator and two board members. "Dr. Bennett," the administrator began, her tone carefully neutral, "we want to start by saying how much we value you as a member of our team." Elijah nodded, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "With the recent attention surrounding the incident on your flight," she continued, "we've received some inquiries from the press. While we support you fully, we need to ensure that this doesn't impact the hospital's reputation." Elijah's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting that I'm responsible for how others perceive this incident? Not at all, she said quickly. We just want to ensure that we handle this delicately. Perhaps it would be best if you refrained from engaging with the media directly. The message was clear. Protect the institution at all costs. Elijah sat back in his chair, the familiar weight of compromise settling over him. Even here, in a place where his expertise and professionalism should have shielded him, the lines of power and perception remained unbalanced. That evening, Elijah stood in his backyard, the cool night air brushing against his face. Vanessa joined him, her presence steady and grounding. What are you thinking? She asked. I'm thinking about how much easier it would be to stay quiet, Elijah admitted. Vanessa didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. You've never taken the easy way out. That's why I married you. Elijah smiled faintly, but the weight of her words settled in his chest. She was right. Staying quiet might be easier, but it wouldn't change anything. And change, however slow and painful, was what the world needed. The whispers surrounding the flight had become a storm, growing louder with each passing day. But Elijah knew that storms didn't last forever. What mattered was what remained in their wake: the rebuilding, the reckoning, and the possibility of something better. As he stood beneath the stars, Elijah made a decision. He would not be silent. Not this time. The fight was far from over. But he was ready to face it, one step at a time. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. The storm wasn't over, but neither was he. The hospital board's request for discretion sat uneasily with Dr. Elijah Bennett. He had heard those words before, phrased differently but with the same intent. Don't make waves. Don't disrupt the status quo. Don't draw too much attention. These were the rules for navigating spaces where his presence was tolerated but rarely welcomed. Elijah understood the game. He had played it his entire life, learning when to smile, when to nod, when to let slights roll off his back like rain. But the slap on the plane had struck something deeper, a place that had grown raw over the years from too many compromises. Too many instances of letting things go for the sake of peace. This time, peace felt like surrender. The first call came from a journalist with a well-known newspaper. She was professional, courteous even, as she explained her interest in covering the story. Dr. Bennett, this isn't just about what happened on that flight, she said. It's about what it represents. Your experience sheds light on the everyday struggles of people navigating a society that often refuses to see them. Elijah hesitated. He wanted to believe her, but he had seen how easily stories could be twisted, how quickly narratives could shift from exposing injustice to scrutinizing the victim. Thank you, he said finally, his voice measured, but I need time to think. The journalist understood. Take your time, she said, but just know, stories like this don't stay quiet for long. As the days passed, the story grew. News outlets picked up the viral video, replaying it on endless loops. Commentators debated the implications, their voices filling the airwaves with analysis and conjecture. Some framed the incident as a symptom of a larger societal sickness. Others dismissed it as a one-off conflict, devoid of deeper meaning. Elijah watched these debates from a distance, his unease growing. He recognized the danger of letting others control the narrative, but he also knew the risks of stepping into the spotlight. The choice was made for him when a former patient approached him at the hospital. She was an older black woman, her gait slow but steady as she made her way toward him. Dr. Bennett, she said, her voice firm despite her age. I saw you on the news. Elijah braced himself, unsure of what was coming. What happened to you on that plane? She continued. It wasn't just about you. It was about all of us who've had to swallow our pride and stay silent when we were wronged. But you, her voice wavered. You have a chance to speak for us. Her words struck Elijah like a blow. He nodded, unable to speak, and she placed a hand on his arm. Don't let them bury this, she said softly. We need you to stand. That evening, Elijah sat with Vanessa in their living room. The television muted. The weight of the patient's words lingered, mingling with his own doubts. What if speaking up makes things worse? He asked. Vanessa tilted her head, her eyes thoughtful. Worse for who? For the airline? For the hospital? Or for you? Elijah frowned. For all of it. I don't want this to define me. I'm a doctor, not a symbol. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice soft but insistent. You've been a symbol your whole life, Elijah, whether you wanted to be or not. Every time you walk into a room, People see more than just a doctor. They see what they've been taught to see. She reached for his hand. This isn't just about you. It's about what you represent. And whether you like it or not, people are watching. They need to see someone stand tall. The next morning, Elijah made his decision. He called the journalist, agreeing to an interview. Her questions were thoughtful, her tone respectful, but the act of recounting the incident felt like reopening a wound. "Do you think what happened was about race?" she asked at one point. Her voice careful. Elijah took a moment before answering. "I think it's about power," he said finally. "And in this country, race is always tied to power." She saw me as someone she could dismiss, someone whose presence she could challenge without consequence. That's the story here, not just what happened to me, but what happens to people like me every day. The interview went live the following week, sparking a new wave of conversation. Elijah received messages of support from colleagues, strangers, and community leaders, but the backlash was swift as well. Social media became a battleground. Some praised Elijah for speaking out, while others accused him of overreacting or seeking attention. The attacks ranged from dismissive comments to outright vitriol. "He's just playing the victim," one commenter wrote. "Not everything is about race." Another went further. "If he's so fragile, maybe he shouldn't fly at all." Elijah read these comments late into the night, his chest tight with anger and frustration. Vanessa found him at the kitchen table, his phone glowing in the dark. "Stop," she said gently, taking the phone from his hands. "You can't let them steal your peace." Elijah sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's not about peace, Vanessa. It's about the fact that they don't want to see the truth. They never do." The following week, Elijah was invited to speak at a community forum on racial bias. The room was packed, a mix of faces young and old, black and white, hopeful and weary. As he stepped to the podium, he felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. "I didn't ask to be here," he began, his voice steady. "I didn't ask for what happened to me on that flight. But I'm here because what happened to me is part of a larger story, a story we all know too well." He paused, meeting the eyes of the audience. "The slap wasn't just about me. It was about what happens when people think they can act without accountability. It was about the small ways power is used to remind us of our place. And it was about the fact that we're expected to take it. To stay silent, to move on." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over them. "But I'm tired of staying silent," he continued, "and I know many of you are, too. If we want things to change, we can't just wait for others to act. We have to demand it. We have to hold people accountable, not just individuals, but the systems that allow this to happen." When he finished, the applause was thunderous. Elijah stepped down from the podium, feeling lighter but no less aware of the long road ahead. That night, as he lay in bed, Elijah thought of Karen Hollis. He wondered if she was watching the news, if she was reflecting on her actions, if she understood the weight of what she had done. He doubted it, but for the first time, he realized that her understanding wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that people were finally paying attention, and the silence that had long protected people like her was beginning to crack. The storm wasn't over, but the winds were shifting. Elijah could feel it, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to hope. The community forum had marked a shift. Dr. Elijah Bennett, once determined to remain a private man, had become a public figure overnight. Invitations poured in from organizations, universities, and media outlets, each wanting to hear his voice on racial bias, professional integrity, and the broader societal implications of his experience. But with the attention came the pressure. Every word he spoke, every interview he gave, became fuel for both sides of the ongoing debate. Supporters lauded him as a symbol of resilience and justice, while detractors dismissed him as an opportunist or worse. "I didn't ask for this," Elijah told Vanessa one evening, his voice heavy with exhaustion. He sat at their kitchen table, the faint glow of his laptop casting shadows across his face. "No, but it found you," Vanessa replied, "and maybe that's because it had to." The next challenge came in the form of legal proceedings. Elijah had been approached by civil rights lawyers who believed the airline should face accountability, not just for Karen Hollis's actions but for the systemic failures that allowed such incidents to occur. Elijah had resisted at first. "I'm not looking for a lawsuit," he told them. "I just want change." But lawsuits force change, one lawyer argued. They make institutions listen when nothing else does. Reluctantly, Elijah agreed to file a formal complaint against the airline, demanding a review of their training policies and practices. The announcement sparked another wave of public reaction. News outlets ran headlines like, "Dr. Sue's Airline After Racially Charged Incident," while opinion pieces questioned whether Elijah's fight for justice was genuine or self-serving. Social media erupted with polarized takes. The comments section of every post a battlefield of arguments. The stress of the lawsuit weighed on Elijah. Every day brought new challenges, calls from reporters, inquiries from his legal team, and the endless barrage of public scrutiny. One morning, as he walked into the hospital, he noticed the shift. Colleagues who once greeted him warmly now avoided his gaze. Conversations hushed as he entered the room, and even patients seemed to look at him differently. During a staff meeting, the chief administrator pulled him aside. "Elijah," she began, her tone cautious, "you've always been an exemplary member of this team, and we value you deeply. But the attention surrounding your case has been challenging for the hospital." Elijah stiffened. "Challenging how?" She hesitated. "Some patients have expressed concerns. They feel uncomfortable with the media presence and the divisiveness of the situation." Elijah stared at her, his voice low but firm. "You mean they're uncomfortable because I refuse to stay silent?" The administrator flushed. "That's not what I'm saying. But it's what you mean," Elijah said, turning to leave. And maybe that's part of the problem. The tension at work mirrored the tension in his personal life. Old friends, people he had known for years, began to distance themselves. Invitations to gatherings dwindled, replaced by polite but strained messages of support. "It's not that they don't care," Vanessa told him one night. "They just don't know how to handle it." "Handle what?" Elijah asked, his frustration bubbling over. "The fact that I won't be quiet? The fact that I won't make it easy for them to ignore what's happening." Vanessa placed a hand on his arm. "Yes," she said simply. Amid the growing challenges, Elijah found solace in unexpected places. A letter arrived from a former patient, a young man whose life Elijah had saved years ago. "Dr. Bennett," the letter began, "I saw the video of what happened to you, and I couldn't stay silent. I remember the way you treated me with dignity, respect, and care when I was at my lowest. You taught me that I was worth saving. Now I want to say the same to you. Don't let them break you. You're worth fighting for." The letter brought tears to Elijah's eyes. It was a reminder that the work he had dedicated his life to saving others, restoring their faith in humanity, was bigger than the noise surrounding him. But the greatest test came when Elijah received an invitation to appear on a nationally televised panel. The event, billed as a conversation on racial bias and power dynamics, promised to be both an opportunity and a battlefield. Vanessa was hesitant. "You know they're going to try to trip you up," she warned. "I know," Elijah said, "but I can't keep avoiding these conversations. If I don't speak, they'll fill the silence with their own narratives." The panel featured a mix of voices: activists, corporate representatives, and a conservative commentator known for dismissing claims of systemic racism. Elijah entered the room with a sense of purpose. But the atmosphere was electric with tension. The conversation began civilly enough, but it didn't take long for the commentator to turn his attention to Elijah. "With all due respect, Dr. Bennett," the man said, his tone calculated, "don't you think you're making this incident into something bigger than it is? After all, isn't it possible that this was just a case of one person having a bad day?" Elijah leaned forward, his gaze steady. "If it were just one person having a bad day, why does it happen so often? Why are there countless stories like mine, from people in every corner of this country, who are dismissed, humiliated, or harmed simply for existing in spaces they have every right to be in?" The commentator smirked. "Anecdotes don't prove systemic issues." "No," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. "But patterns do. And the patterns are everywhere if you're willing to see them." The audience erupted into applause. But Elijah barely noticed. He wasn't speaking for them. He was speaking for himself. For the young man who had written him that letter. For the patients who had whispered their support. And for the countless others who carried the same scars he did. When the panel ended, Elijah stepped outside into the cool night air. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of clarity. The challenges were far from over: the lawsuit, the media scrutiny, the tensions at work, but he had found his voice. And he wasn't about to lose it. The fight wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about what had been happening for generations. and what could no longer be ignored. As he looked up at the stars, Elijah felt a quiet resolve settle over him. The road ahead was long, but he was ready to walk it step by step, storm by storm, until the echoes of history no longer drowned out the promise of change. The courtroom was colder than Dr. Elijah Bennett expected. Rows of benches filled with observers, some familiar faces. Many strangers created a hum of expectation. On one side sat the airline's legal team, polished and confident. On the other, Elijah and his attorneys, their expressions solemn but determined. This was the culmination of months of tension, scrutiny, and quiet battles fought in the spaces between public outrage and private exhaustion. Elijah's lawsuit against the airline had become a flashpoint, a symbolic reckoning for countless unspoken injustices. And today, the court would hear closing arguments. As Elijah sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands resting calmly on the polished wood, he glanced across the room and saw her, Karen Hollis. She was not part of the defense team, but she had come. Her posture was stiff, her face pale. Their eyes met briefly, but there was no shared understanding, no silent truce, just two people caught in the same storm, carrying different burdens. The airline's lawyer rose first, their tone measured and precise. They spoke of policies and procedures, of corporate responsibility and human error. They acknowledged the slap but framed it as an isolated incident, a moment of personal failure that shouldn't tarnish the institution as a whole. When they finished, Elijah's attorney stood. Unlike their counterpart, they didn't begin with policies or legal jargon. Instead, they began with Elijah. This case is not about one flight or one man, they said. It's about a culture, a system that allows moments like this to happen again and again. With little accountability and even less reflection. Dr. Bennett was not just slapped by a flight attendant. He was reminded, in the most humiliating way, that his presence in certain spaces is still seen as a disruption. The words hung in the air, heavy and unflinching. This case is about more than damages. It's about change. And if we are serious about addressing the root causes of these incidents, then we must confront the systems that allow them to thrive. That starts here, in this courtroom. After the closing arguments, the judge announced that a decision would be issued in the coming weeks. Elijah felt the weight of the moment as he exited the courtroom. The eyes of reporters and onlookers following him. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward him. But he said nothing. It wasn't about the immediate outcome. He reminded himself, it was about what came next. The weeks that followed were a blur of anticipation and reflection. Elijah returned to his work at the hospital, finding solace in the familiarity of caring for others. But even there, the echoes of the lawsuit followed him. Patients asked him about the case. Colleagues avoided the topic entirely, their silence louder than any words could have been. One afternoon, Elijah received an unexpected call. It was from Karen. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice hesitant. Elijah hesitated, his mind racing. After a long pause, he agreed to meet her in a small cafe near the courthouse. When Karen arrived, she looked different, smaller. Somehow, her usual composure was replaced by an unsteady vulnerability. She sat across from Elijah, avoiding his gaze for a moment before finally speaking. "I wanted to apologize," she began, "not because I have to, but because I need to." Elijah didn't interrupt. He let her words come at their own pace. "What I did on that flight was inexcusable," she continued. "I've spent months trying to understand why I acted the way I did. And the truth is, I don't know. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was my own prejudices. Ones I didn't even realize I had. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that I hurt you. And I hurt myself in the process." Her voice cracked. "I lost my job, my career, my reputation. But none of that compares to what I took from you in that moment. Your dignity, your peace." Elijah studied her, his expression unreadable. "Why now?" he asked. Karen's eyes met his. "Because I'm trying to be better. And because I want you to know that I see you not as a symbol. Not as a reminder of my mistakes. But as a person. And I'm sorry." Elijah nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. The words felt heavy, but they carried a quiet truth. Forgiveness didn't come easily. But understanding was a step forward. When the court ruling finally came, it was a victory not just for Elijah, but for the broader cause. The airline was ordered to implement mandatory bias training for all employees and to create an independent review board for passenger complaints. Elijah's legal team had also secured a public acknowledgement of the incident and an apology from the airline's leadership. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Months later, Elijah stood before a crowd at a university lecture hall, invited to speak about his experience. The room was filled with students, faculty, and community members, their faces a mix of curiosity and expectation. He began quietly, his voice measured. "I didn't choose this fight," he said, "but sometimes, the fight chooses you. What happened to me on that plane was not unique. It was part of a pattern, one that stretches back generations and continues today. But it's not enough to name the problem. We have to do the work of dismantling it." He paused, scanning the audience. That work starts with each of us. With how we see one another. With how we hold each other accountable. And most importantly, with how we refuse to accept the systems that tell us some people belong and others do not. The applause was thunderous, but Elijah felt no triumph. Instead, he felt a quiet determination, a resolve to keep walking the long road ahead. As the lecture hall emptied, Elijah stepped outside into the cool evening air. Vanessa joined him, slipping her hand into his. "You did good," she said. He smiled faintly. "It's not over." "No," she agreed, "but you're still standing." Elijah looked up at the stars, the vastness of the night sky reminding him of the work yet to be done. The fight against racism, against the quiet violence of exclusion, was not one that would end in his lifetime. But it was a fight worth waging. For himself, for his children, and for the world he hoped they would inherit. The storm hadn't passed, but the winds were shifting. Change was slow, painful, and uncertain, but it was coming, and Elijah Bennett was ready to meet it.